All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for this week's Snack and Chat, Adopt for Life's weekly Facebook Live, where we explore the topics that are top of mind for families formed by adoption, kinship, and customary care. My name is Chantal, Community Engagement Liaison with Adopt for Life, and also Snack and Chat host today. So let's see if I can fill those shoes. I will do my best. Today, our guest is Wendy Louise Hayes, and she's here to talk about her new book of poems, The Heart That Silence Built, poems about adoption, trauma, permanency, and family. Wendy is an adoptee and a first voice advocate in child protection and adoption and permanency. Professionally, Wendy is the owner and operator of W Strategic Branding and Marketing, where she provides marketing services with the lens of intersectionality, anti-capitalism, and justice, doing to small businesses with a social impact. As a first voice advocate, Wendy is highly involved in various communities and initiatives. She is the co-founder of the Ontario Children's Advancement Coalition, a trainer at Never Too Late, currently leading advocacy work on the falsification of birth records, and recently became, as we know why she's here, a self-published author with her poetry anthology. So if that's still not enough, she is also a part-time student working towards becoming a psychotherapist. So back to the anthology, The Heart That Silence Built, healing from many of the unspoken pains of her adoption journey. Wendy explores themes of love, family, loss, grief, and trauma with this book. Silence and its impact on identity is another major theme explored, with the hopes that it will touch the hearts of many adoptees that hold unspoken truths about their journeys. Wendy started writing poetry the year her younger sister was born, and this book features work authored between the ages of 12 and 30 from a complex adoption journey. So, Wendy, thank you so much
for that wonderful introduction.
Wow, well deserved, of course. Thanks so much for coming on and talking about this amazing book that you published. I mean, that is amazing. So congratulations, first of all.
Thank you. Yeah, I just published it in the summer and I'm really excited to be here. So thank you so much for having me on, especially during Adoption Awareness Month. That's great.
That's right, Adoption Awareness Month. And so I think we'll just get started because I have so many questions and I know we only have 45 minutes. So we're going to do it.
Okay.
So like I said in the beginning, that the book is a collection of poems that you wrote between the ages of 12 and 30. I just said it, but I already forgot it. Then that you started writing the year that your sister was born. So if you could sort of like, do you want to talk more about that and how that, did you just decide I'm going to write a poem or?
Yeah. So
why you started writing.
So there's 12 years actually between my sister and I. And I have this very distinct memory of her as like a baby on the couch, and I'm sitting next to them. And so when they were a baby, I just turned 12 years old. And I just remember thinking, I wonder what they're thinking about this little baby that's next to me. And so I wrote a poem called Wondering. And that was one of the first poems I ever wrote. And I wrote 3 poems in one night. And I can't explain how or when or why. They just, it's one of those things where it just happened. Like they just kind of appeared on paper. And it's just very interesting in my journey that it happened so close around the same time as my sibling being born, because all of the poems are themed around our journey in permanency and adoption and through child protection. So I can't say that I didn't like just decide I'm going to be a poet one day and publish a book. I kind of just started writing. I was like an angsty teenager who was an emo. So you can imagine I have tons of poetry like that. There's a lot that didn't make it into this book. But I think a lot of my poetry is kind of inspired by these little moments I have in life. And I think that I write about those moments a lot and they kind of come through. So that's kind of like when I think about the origin story of when I started. That's what I think about.
Yeah. So writing those poems was your outlet, like that creative outlet that
Yeah.
really worked, that filled a need. So was it something that you not necessarily did every day, but it was just part of what you did?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a time when I was writing like all the time, like something every day. And there are times that I don't write as often for sure. But I definitely have like a mountain of old poems of books, and a lot of them are not very good, to be honest.
Well, it's a process. It's a process, right? They
It
can't,
is.
not everybody can paint a masterpiece every day either, right? So,
That's true. That's true.
so the book, who should, I mean, besides just saying everybody should get this book, who would benefit, I guess,
Yeah.
from owning and reading this?
Yeah. I think it's very centered around the adoption permanency experience. So I think anyone who's in that constellation, professionals who work with young people, parents of young people who have experience in child protection, who become parents through that kind of family building journey of permanency rather than birth. I think it's really important for those folks to read this. I think other adoptees I would love to have read it. Like I would hope that the work resonates and maybe helps name some things that are very difficult to name, I think. And sometimes we can't always name them in a way that's like through education or, there's something different that we get through the creative outlet, I think. And I think anyone who has felt rejection from people who love them or like they can't be themselves, I think would resonate with the theme in this book, because I think that's a big part of it, is putting away parts of ourselves to make others more comfortable around us, right? And I think that there's no coincidence that a lot of that also comes from my journey as a queer person. And so I think a lot of that poetry would resonate in queer communities as well. But those are kind of the folks I think about when I think about this book.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing that. I mean, for me as an adoptee, like there were definitely like the whole book is amazing and it spoke to me. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, so you'll have to stay tuned about a certain ones that really, really, really hit home for me. But we'll save that for later. So you're coming, like you just spoke about those certain audiences that you would hope would
Mhm.
get something out of this, specifically adoptees, but also maybe from that, like what is the importance or maybe the significance of having those people with lived experience, whether it's welfare, foster care, being adopted, or
Mhm.
um, whatever that lived experience is for that person, of sharing those perspectives and
Mhm.
experiences.
Mhm.
I mean, that's not for everybody to share their journeys, but
Yeah.
when they do, what do you
Mhm.
think?
I think first voice advocates are people with that living expertise and experience. I think centering those voices is crucial. And I mean, those voices need to be actively present in this work. We cannot make systems or relationships that come out of systems, because while, adoption is maybe not the system in the same way child protection is, it comes out of that system, right? And you can't change those systems without listening to people who have lived that experience, because they have such a unique lens on the situation. Um, and I think too that one thing I see a lot of in these spaces and with disenfranchised folks is a fear to speak up, and not even being able to necessarily put words to these experiences because we have them so young, right? And so we always talk about how we have all these experiences, like sometimes pre-cognitive, so like pre-language, and we don't even know how to name them because they happened to us before we had words. And so I think that it's so important to center those. It's so crucial. This work cannot be done without those voices. And what's really important too is, I have a background in marketing actually, and we talk about psychology a lot in marketing. And one of the things we talk about is people remember moments based on their emotions. And you're more likely to remember something if you're emotionally involved in it, and that what emotion you have really influences how you remember it too, right? And so when we talk about interactions with brands. We talk about creating a moment and a special feeling, but that's, as storytellers, as human beings, we're storytellers. And this really is heart work, right? When I really think about permanency and adoption, it's heart work. And there's the knowledge part too, but being able to shift that and being able to do that heart work means emotionally connecting with those pieces. And I think that listening to First Voices is how we give ourselves the opportunity to do that. And I specifically say give ourselves the opportunity because I think it's for everyone in the community to make sure that First Voices are in their life somehow and that they're always receiving messages from First Voices. I think that's really important.
Amazing. That's super interesting too. So the whole psychology story lens too, right? Like
yeah.
So I mentioned at the beginning, and like for those of you that don't have the book, you'll definitely be finding out how you can get a copy. But the poems are a collection of poems around those themes: adoption, trauma, permanency, family, and like I said at the beginning, silence is also another theme, and its impact on that person. So if you could share with what you're comfortable with, how this shaped your voice and your whole experience. I mean, we just touched on how, you know what I mean, some experiences happen before we can even have a voice, and how that shapes our voice. And specifically what customary care and adoptive families can do to ensure they aren't unknowingly promoting silence within a family. Because nobody would go out and say they're purposely doing that, but there could be things that they don't realize, right? So how do we promote those voices to be heard?
I think a really big part of my personal journey was a lot of difficult conversations not being had. And so I think one of the reflexes we have as parents, specifically to protect our kids, is to kind of shy away from hard stuff. And that's totally normal. And I think that's like a defense thing for both ourselves and our kids, right? I think it's for both parties. And just again, socially, I don't think we're really conditioned or taught how to do hard things like this. And so we have all these big, complicated emotions and these conversations that kind of happen around them that are very, very difficult. But the thing is, not having those conversations doesn't make those hard things go away. It just puts them deeper. It just makes them bury down. And when I think about that, I think the hope and the opportunity there is that learning can help us identify those hard conversations that we need to have. Because when we come to adoption and permanency journeys with a humbleness and a desire to understand and learn, we can learn to identify these difficult things that we know are going to be present, whether we know about them or not, or whether we're talking about them or not. Because I think in adoption education, we see there's so many common experiences and so many common lessons we can take into our lives. And so I think that's it, is that we have to have those hard conversations, because when we don't, those things bury and they fester and they ruin relationships, and they cause disruptions later in life. And the families are not served by ignoring these conversations, and they're not supported either in doing this work usually. And that's a really big part of this problem, is we're asking families to do really hard work, and then we're saying, but figure it out, okay, bye, or not we, but the system, you know what I mean? And it is very hard, and I do want to honor that, and I also just want to acknowledge and balance that with not being able to figure out how to do the work around those pieces is not going to make them go away. And I think that's the impact of silence. Is, I kind of mentioned earlier, I just learned to put parts of me away that made my family uncomfortable, and that really impacted my belonging in that family and my relationship with them more later than anything immediate too. And that's the other hard thing, I think, with anything. It's like, oh, later, we'll do this later, and then suddenly 20 years has passed by and you're like, oh, it's later. How did that happen? So I don't share any of this thinking, again, from that place of it's malicious. I don't believe it is. And we're so unsupported in doing these work as a family. you have to find your support group and your network to really help you through.
And I think like anything that's difficult, you have to keep at it. You have to practice.
Yeah.
And there might be a conversation centered around something that's difficult and it doesn't really go well. And that's okay
Yeah.
too, because you
Yeah.
have to keep trying. And the more you talk about things that seem difficult, they will become easier and easier. And it becomes the way that your family communicates. And I think things are much different now, or could be different now. When I was adopted, everything was closed and there was just no information. So it was really difficult for my parents to have those conversations because they didn't have support. They didn't have support with the peers,
Yeah.
So I think a lot of that has shifted, which is great. And it helps support parents who have that peer connection that they can help and ask for suggestions. So I think that's great. Thank you. Okay, next question. So when you were putting together all these poems, like it must have been like, I don't know what it must have been. What was it like going back and rereading all those poems from?
It was really weird. It was really weird. I mean, I go back and I joked earlier that some of them were bad, but I mean, some of them were really bad. So it was just like, oh my gosh, I'm happy they all exist. Don't get me wrong. And that's something I actually got to appreciate looking back, right? As a little bit of progression in the work and seeing things as like, oh, I used to write these like, 4-line paragraphs, every other thing rhymed poems. And, I really found my own voice in removing structure and rules and doing that. And so I saw a little bit of evolution, I think, in my writing, which was just really nice personally. But also it was incredibly validating because I don't want to get too much into the details of my relationship with my adoptive parents, but what I will say is that it is moving to a place of estrangement, which means it's moving to a place where there will not be a relationship. And I think a lot of that comes from the pieces we've talked about, right? Like this also was many years ago. It was 15 years ago. We weren't talking about a lot of the things we're talking about now, even 15 years later. There's a lot of support pieces not there. On their front, a lot of opportunity for education that was never really able to be taken up on. And I do think that served as a detriment to the relationship, which is why I talk so much about like, you don't have to do the training to become a perfect person, but when you do the trainings, it helps you figure out the right questions to ask and how you can approach things to build relationship. And so I kind of just had this relationship where I felt like I was constantly swimming upstream to kind of get them to understand what I was going through. And I think adoptees experience this a lot. I think it's very isolating, and I don't think people intend to, but I think we see this online when adoptees speak up about the negative aspects of their journey and see backlash, right? And I think we're kind of told like, you need to get over it, or it's not that bad. And we internalize that, and that's very gaslighty. So I know that's not a term everyone's familiar with, but it's kind of like, something's true, but everyone is just telling you it's not. And so you begin to tell yourself that. And I think that was just kind of my relationship to the truth of my experience. Was I was fed all these narratives that, you have a good story. You were adopted as an older young person, right? I was adopted at 16. People were like, yeah. And, as a fact presented by itself sounds like I'd probably also celebrate if I just heard that. You know what I mean? But these things are so much more complicated. And so I think going back and looking at this poetry and looking over the course of this relationship that I've really struggled to make work, and realize I've felt more or less the same way for so many years, was very validating to a journey of healing and rethinking that relationship. And, I kind of hate to come on here and be like, this book was part of me changing a relationship in this context, but also I think that's why it is so important, because if we don't have these conversations 15 years down the line, we disrupt, right? And so it never feels good to say this is what's going on in my life, but also I think it's important to say that it's going on, because I think when we avoid these pieces, all of that builds and changes the relationship, and it just feels like there's this big wall or this big like rock that I just haven't been able to quite climb over to really show and help understand and explain. And so it's been very, very validating in that sense. And that sounds kind of sad, but also it's kind of important, right?
It's very important. And so thank you for sharing that. As I think that, as you say, the bigger picture is that, it's just another piece of the why, like the silence, right? So I'm going to say this, but not this. It's still not going to convey the whole message. And if that message can be heard by other families who can then take that advice, or not take the advice, but just being able to listen and know that that's part of the work that has to be done, is asking questions and having conversation. So thank you. So as you know, we already mentioned that this month is Adoption Awareness Month. I just was checking down, I'm listening, but there was just a comment back to what you were saying about the narrative, right? And having to silence the adoptees, feeling silent so that everybody's narrative can be happy and yay.
Right. Yeah.
And somebody just added a comment saying, like, that narrative of like, oh, you must, like, to be grateful as an adoptee, or lucky, right? Just is something that we hear sometimes. I never heard it from my parents, but definitely from the outer society, or even through mainstream media. Like that sort of adoption story is always portrayed as we should be lucky and grateful.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And it's hard, right? Especially when that journey comes from such a place of loss. Yeah.
So somebody just asked a question, which actually ties into my next question, which
Amazing.
I know we already talked about, having those hard conversations and as we were talking about suggestions for adoptive families, kin or custody or care. So would you have any advice or thoughts for those families on how would you have that, where do you start? Or where you already started, you're on the journey, how to maintain that open-heartedness, open-mindedness when having those conversations?
I think I would encourage parents to look at themselves and start there. I know that there's a lot of this work that for many very good reasons, it's very uncomfortable, right? And the reason I want to say for many good reasons is because we've learned so much from society, from our own families, about family building and relationships and expectations. And we don't realize how much we're already holding in I think we don't realize how much we're already holding in our minds about these things until we're presented and challenged by them. And so I think, as we learn as parents, I'm saying I don't actually have kids, but I have a very parentified relationship with my siblings. So I'm going to just put myself in this group. I know it's not the same thing. But, I think we have to kind of as we learn things or come across topics in adoption and we feel ourselves get uncomfortable, don't power through it. I think that moment of uncomfortableness is an opportunity to be like, I'm having a reaction to this. I wonder why. And I think that the education piece is so important, and it's only a part of it. And when we can actually make time for that very intentional, reflective work of what makes me uncomfortable, why these reasons are valid, what are the other perspectives on this, right? And that's where the first voices comes in. We can kind of start to identify what things get us going. And those are the things we're going to avoid. And I think it's important to do that, again, that heart work, that emotion work, because these things don't come up in a moment when we're all chilling on the couch and we're ready to have deep, thoughtful conversation. These things come up in the middle of fights, when it's going to be thrown at you in your face and you're going to be pulling your hair out because you're like, my child, what's that? They just know the right buttons to push. And they always do, because the buttons are there, right? So find your own buttons. Try poking and prodding at them to see what you can do, and breathe through that and work through that level of discomfort. I think that's so, so important. And I know it's not necessarily cut and dry, clean, here's the 5-step rule to doing things, but I think that when we're uncomfortable with something, it's harder for us to then have those conversations and create that space. And again, I see that that's very personal to me because I saw that coming out of my own dynamic. Things about me and my story that made my parents uncomfortable, right? And that doesn't take words. You feel that. You learn that through the unspoken nuances of your interactions, right? Reading between the lines. And when you're holding that emotional thing, it's going to come through regardless of how much you like psychoeducate and right, because it's there and that's where you're going to react from. It's your heart place, I think. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I like that. Don't power through, because most people, like, you get that feeling and you don't, your initial reflex is to avoid that, right? We all avoid pain or avoid, like, that's like survival, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to the health of your family, it's important to, yes, acknowledge the emotion, but then reflect, right? Take the time to reflect. Why is this making me feel this?
And not in a way that you're like scrutinizing yourself,
Oh,
or just
no.
like, no, and I know I'm clarifying, right? It's like what I'm not saying this is a exercise and all the things that are wrong with me because I'm reacting. It's literally just like, if we don't think about it and gives ourselves time to think of, like, we won't. So it's supposed to be a gentle practice, and really it should help you move towards a place where you can regulate better and identify things that upset you and know when to step away and when to talk and when to be like, oh crap, I should have stepped away, but I talked and I'm sorry.
And I like the idea of like pushing your own buttons, like make your own, and like sort of like that exercise of like, because then you can practice like, how it feels and what process to go through. I'm going to carry on because I could just chat about this all day, but we do have limited time. So Adoption Awareness Month, Adopt for Life, for those that are following us, that we're this theme focusing on language, and the whole theme that we're going is about how language matters and the power of words. To begin the process or continuing on the journey of learning, we have to be open to, can you hear me? Because my thing froze. Okay. Everybody okay? Okay.
Yeah.
It's just listening, right? Listening to the voices of those with lived experience. So I guess along with that theme, again, I'm asking for more of your, like, for our community of families, when it comes to language and the power of words, like why is it so important? Why does it come down to the words we choose, and why are those so important when talking about adoption, permanency, family, all these things? Any insights there?
I think, and my perspective here might be, it's a little beyond the adoptee perspective, obviously, like I'm a writer and those pieces, but I think really it's that words have so much context behind them, right? And I think that language has become a really contentious issue over the last few years, especially as I feel like we're experiencing some or noticing or what have you, I don't know exactly, but there's more polarization maybe, and a lot more like this idea of people are very resistant to this idea of language policing. And I think that when we can really bring into context that idea that, again, language is so contextual. There is never a guidebook to right and wrong language that will be forever appropriate. And I think when we're asked to change our language, we have to think about that as an opportunity to better understand the context of that word and the experience of the people asking us to stop using it or use a different word, and ultimately to better understand them, right? Because again, that piece of language, that's really, again, an opportunity, that uncomfortableness, right? Like if someone asks you to use a different word and that pushes your button, we can ask ourselves why. And it's really important to remember too, that when someone asks us to shift our language, they're not asking us to change our personal beliefs, right? They're just asking that we open ourselves up to other experiences and identify and acknowledge the history behind that word and why we're no longer using it. And I think that is such a great opportunity to kind of have that learning moment and move towards language that is more inclusive. I think a really good example that's still relevant to our community is like the 2S LGBTQ plus acronym. And one thing I always tell people is, in like a marketing sense too, is just like no one acronym is going to capture the identities of all the people who fall kind of out of this idea of two specific identities. And I think it's really important that we name these groups and we have words for these things. And I also think that it's important to kind of acknowledge that they come with a history and they come with context. And, it's really important to take that all into account with our language, even when it's hard because we're used to saying something. And, my siblings' pronouns has changed recently and I'm still getting used to it, and that's okay. And language is the same. And so when we see things around like birth families or adoptive families, or just using certain languages around pieces, I think it is good to correct and understand, why we try to work towards using certain language to make folks feel more inclusive, because that's, again, that opens up the conversation, right? And also, I think it's important to realize that some people self-identify with these pieces too, and these terminologies we might not really like get, and like we'll have folks too from that community still self-identifying. I think that's important to remember too. Like, for example, I know in like neurodivergent communities, there's a lot of talk about the diagnosis of Asperger's, right? And it's a really great conversation. And we still have people using from that community self-identifying with that language. And I think when we go to a place where it's like just about language policing, it's like, well, we have to understand everything that's happening here. And we can always just kind of lead by example. I think that's an important thing too, is like sometimes it's not about just going in and like correcting people. It's also about just leading by example and hoping that folks will pick up. And that's the way language works. It adapts to us, right? Like there's a reason we have LOL now. And if we never had smartphones, we might have never had the word LOL, right? Or acronym or whatever you want to call it. But I think it is so important though. And I'm someone who really thinks there's a lot of power in the words we use, for sure. So I think, yeah, it's really important to be like, why am I uncomfortable? What does this mean to me? And what do I need to learn about this word that is going to help me understand why it's so hard for this person or these people or this group or whatever community.
Yeah, as you say, it's always evolving. And like you said, there's never going to be the one manual that's always going to be forever true when it comes to words and language. And I really like what you said about how it's just an opportunity to further your understanding about the context, right? And I like that shift. It's as seeing as an opportunity. Right way to, share that message about looking at the power of our words. So the time is ticking. Okay, so at the beginning of the book, and it also at the end, there's the acknowledgements. You mentioned your sister. So she takes stage a lot throughout the book.
Yes.
If you're comfortable to share more about that dynamic between your sister and about what it was like sharing the book and how that
Yeah. So if I didn't have a sibling, I wouldn't have been adopted. That's my theory. I certainly wouldn't have met my parents, because my parents at the time were looking for a toddler. And while they had the mind to think, oh, like we don't want to separate siblings, and I think that's really important to consider, they weren't going out of their way looking for a 16-year-old troublemaker fresh from the child protection system. Not a lot of people are, unfortunately, which really is unfortunate, because troublemakers are the best kind. But anyways, I won't get stuck on that. But really, I think that my whole sort of journey really revolves around my sister, and not in any way. I don't say that in any way that like I'm blaming them, or like I'm like about it. I just like, I wouldn't have met my family unless I had a sibling. I know that when I was in child welfare, they were preparing me to lose my sibling um, when they were initially looking at an adoption plan, right? So I might have lost contact at all. And because of my age, I was definitely not adoptable. They were not going to be looking for a family for me. And so I just feel like every kind of step of this process really revolved around my siblings' needs and not mine. And so a lot of the pieces I really needed in the situation were missing. And that's not my siblings' fault. I think that's a system error. Like that's just a really big flaw in our system. And again, a lack of support and education, maybe for my family, also unsupported by the system. Right. But I entered relationship with them to keep my relationship with my sister because I had lost everything, right? At that point, I wasn't going to live with my biological mom again. I had lost my community from when I had been brought into child welfare. I had lost my sibling and I hadn't, but I was supposed to have, and I almost had. And of course, I was going to follow them wherever they were going to go. But one thing they don't realize, and again, I think this is the dynamic of silence, is that throughout my whole entire life, my parents had the ability to end the relationship with my sibling for any reason at any point in time. There was nothing safeguarding that. And while I don't think they ever would have, it was still there.
Yeah.
And so when I think about that, I think about I kept my head low. I tried to make sure my siblings' needs were met. I tried not to butt heads with anyone so that I wouldn't risk my relationship. And so that's why I think really at the center of this experience is them, and some of the work I've been having to do recently as an adult is be like, okay, I can take care of myself now. Like I'm a big kid. I need to like take care of myself too. You know, your own mask first. So I think that's like a really big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for sharing that. So the poem, so the title of the book, The Heart.
Yeah.
It's also a poem in there.
Okay.
And like I mentioned earlier when we were talking about that, like for me, like they're all just super, like really powerful. But that one really like really spoke to me, like spoke my truth in a way that I wasn't probably ever able to say it myself. So
that means so much, Chantal. Thank you for sharing that.
Don't make me cry on Facebook Live. But just that, I mean, and everybody in terms of if they're an adoptee, there's no way that like everybody's family is unique. Every adoptee's journey is unique.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that hit me, do you feel that there is a collective truth for adoptees, that silence that we feel like that can show up? Like for me, it was like, oh, I have to get like good grades and don't talk back to my parents, or like all these little minor things that you think you're doing just because that's what good kids do. But as you grow up and realize, oh, maybe I was doing that for another reason. So is there this collective thing that we feel that way? Or another follow-up question is that if there are adoptees watching this, maybe, is there anything that you would like to share with them?
Yeah, for sure. I think, first of all, thank you so much for sharing that. And obviously I can't speak for all adoptees, but what I can say is that those little adjustments we make to just not put the relationship at risk and just not butt heads and just not make sure we're lovable. And I think that thing adoptees have, that we just have an extra, like, I have to figure out how to be lovable. And we just adapt and become chameleons. And I do think that it's very incredibly common. And I would never say tell anyone who says that's not my experience different, or that they have to feel that way, obviously. But I do think that that's something that has come up a lot since I've published the book that even I was not anticipating. And like certain poems have resonated with people that really surprised me. Like I've been like, I really love to hear that, because one of them I almost didn't include. And one of them is like, someone's like, this poem is like my favorite. Like I'm going to be reading it to everyone all the time. like, okay. So it's like really interesting to see that. But I do think there is that common just, it's like that masking, that idea, if you're familiar with masking, for neurodivergent folks and neurotypical folks, this idea that like we kind of pretend to be normal like everyone else. And I think adoptees have some version of that. I have to present or be normal like everyone else because we don't have anything around us that mirrors what we're going through unless we have that community. And again, that's very like, because I think that's a very like estranged, like it really estranges us from ourselves almost. And I think, I do think writing in any kind of way is super helpful to that process of naming our things and figuring out where they come from. And like, you don't have to be a creative writer. I think bullet journaling is super great. It's not a one-stop shop. It's not a one size fits all, but I think reclaiming the narrative, because we hear so many messages from other people, is so important. And I do see writing as a tool to do that.
That's awesome. Thanks. So we're nearing the end, but I want to save some time specific. There's a few things that I still want to talk about. So quickly, maybe I will be adding in the comments for those of it that want to know more about the book, who want to purchase the book. I'm going to put a link to the website. But I know you just published, but did this maybe create any kind of like, oh, maybe I'll do another one, like a follow up, or are you still just really focused on this? And I did kind of look and see that there may be a podcast coming up.
Yes. So definitely no books in the future, not yet. Definitely, I'm definitely working on this one. But what I am really excited about, and kind of comes right out of my last point, is I'm really excited to be launching a podcast, hopefully in the new year. And I want to feature other first voice advocates and adoptees and young people to come and talk about how writing helps us with that healing and reclaiming process. And so I'm really excited to feature other writers and other artists, not even necessarily creative writers. So if you're hearing this or you know a young person who wants to participate and get involved in the community, I don't care if they bullet journal, that's going to count. As long as any kind of writing is happening, I don't care if they're writing fan fiction, whatever it is. I want to hear about it. I know you, Chantel's Googling, but I want to hear about it, and I want to have them on the podcast. And I really want to take this opportunity to leverage voices from the community for everyone else. Now, I am a first voice advocate, and I do a lot of unpaid labor, and this podcast will be a make it or break it. I do need funding for it. And it will be, I either reach funding or I don't. So if folks are interested in participating or helping that podcast project out, it would be coming out next year. I'll have some more updates about it on my Instagram and Facebook and on my newsletter, which you can find all at heart.silencebuilt.ca. But I'm really excited about doing the podcast, and I really hope it comes through. I'm going to work really hard on getting the funding, because it's really important for me to pay the people who are going to be on the podcast. And that's a really big part of it, is when young people share their expertise and create something that others can learn from and understand, we have to pay them for their expertise, just like I would pay any consultant, right?
Yeah.
Or any guest. So that's a big part of it.
On your website, that even like proceeds of the sale of the book go to, is it never too late?
Yeah. So about 25% of profits goes to the Never Too Late program from the book sales, which is super great. Their program at the Adoption Council of Ontario focused on permanency for young people who are maybe close to or have transitioned out of the system or have found themselves lacking permanency under other circumstances. It's pretty flexible, but it's a really great program. So I'm really happy to support it with profits of the book.
Well, there. Not that anybody needed another reason to buy the book, but if you were still on the fence, that should seal the deal.
Yes.
heart.silencebuilt.ca. I'll put the link in the comments for those that are watching on replay, or if you forgot. We still have a minute. Do you want to read a poem for us?
I will read a poem.
Okay.
Yes.
And I'll try not to cry again.
I'm going to read Excavation today, which I haven't read at a lot of other things. So it's kind of new and exciting. And I'll just tell folks quickly before I read it that I wrote it after my birth mom met my birth sibling after about 13, 14 years of no contact. So this was a pretty big day. So that's what this poem is about. Silence, reverberating through the sinew of my muscles and the marrow of my bones. There are no words for this moment, no words for this short but arduous journey that brought us here, a buried path that seems to extend further than what we can see. We'll excavate it one day. A sigh of relief. My secrets are almost done being kept. A stuttering hello, a nervous laugh. I remember when you cried 11 years ago. I remember when you cried 13 years ago. You didn't know it then, but I collected your tears and saved them in a jar. A forgotten ache, an unnameable distress, Polaroid heart taking pictures of the memories, everything that has brought us here to this moment. Scrapbooking a life they wanted hidden. They say not insecure. They say don't complicate it. They say don't speak, but this don't ask, don't tell silence. But this way you asked anyway, this way I bit my tongue hard and swallowed the blood without notice. They say sorry, but the damage is done. The narrative I haven't told you yet is that I almost didn't make it. Hole-punched fingertips, empty frames and hollow hooks, half a sister, now I speak. Are you done searching, or have you only just begun?
Thank you so much, Wendy. I don't even have the words to say how many thanks I have. Thank you. Thank you for sharing everything that you shared with us today. It was so meaningful, and it's so appreciated. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. Thank you for writing this and sharing it with the world. It's a beautiful thing that you did.
Thank you. Thank you.
So best of luck, and I hope that we can talk more about it another time, because we are running out of time.
Yes.
Thank you for everyone that joined us today, whether you joined us live or maybe you're watching this on replay. Thank you for taking time to be with us as well. I want to wish everybody a great week and to take care of yourselves, and bye for now.